So in this lesson, we're gonna add the Phoenix FD dust to the sim. Now, the challenge that we're facing is how do we make the smoke go around in this spiral and follow all the debris? You know, we can't just use Typhlo's find target on Phoenix. We need to find a way with Phoenix's tools to get the smoke to behave in this way. The other issues we're facing is that if you try to emit smoke out of all of these pieces as geometry and then have the smoke sort of bounce off of all of them, it's gonna just take absolutely forever to sim. So we're gonna use a few workarounds to speed this up and get some dust in the scene to behave like this. So just like in the barn scene, first we need to create a Phoenix grid. So down here, I'll just create a fire and smoke grid. You can click auto grid and just create a box right around the front of the building. And just make sure that you cover the entire front area, that possibly some dust may be born back here. Then we need a fire source. Say add, and add the tie cache for the concrete. Now just make sure for the tie cache that you go under elements and enable particle interface, just to make sure that it's working with Phoenix properly. And for the fire source, I'm gonna help you out, guys, a little bit because I've already done this. So I know that the value for the smoke here should be pretty low. So I just did 0.2 centimeters here. I did 0.1 for noise just to give it a little bit of noise. The temperature we're gonna set to 300 because there's no gravity in the scene and 300 is neutral temperature. So I don't want the smoke to go up or down. I just want it to sort of hover, and then the forces are gonna attract it in the middle of this, vortex. So for the smoke, I ended up doing 0.7 just to reduce it a little bit. I kept getting too much smoke, so I really wanted to reduce that quite a bit. And now down here, you have the PRT shape. Now, if you've taken my fire course, I showed you that you need to switch this to use particle shape if you want Phoenix to recognize this as actual geometry. So we had like a smaller building destruction in the fire course, and we emitted dust out of the broken faces of that building. However, after trying that, I realized that there's just way too much going on and there are way too many pieces to make that simulatable. You really would need a farm to get something like that done. It just takes a long time to emit smoke out of all of this as geometry. So we are actually gonna leave this as sphere 1 voxel. So actually what will happen is Phoenix will emit smoke out of each of the pieces as if it's just one sphere that is as big as 1 voxel. Now, luckily, since there are so many pieces, you can't really tell. It just looks like there's dust being born everywhere, and you can't really tell where it's coming from. You know that it's sort of coming from the destruction, but you can't really tell where from, and that's good for us because we can just sort of hide what we're doing. So I'm gonna leave this set as sphere 1 voxel, and that's just gonna rapidly speed up the simulation. Now, the other thing I wanna do is the smoke is actually not interacting with the pieces at all. The pieces might as well not be there because Phoenix doesn't see them. If you right click on this concrete tie cache and go to Phoenix FD properties, we are gonna uncheck solid object. If you leave it checked, the smoke will interact with all the pieces, but the difference I found is almost unnoticeable. You really can't tell. You might get some slightly cooler results, but considering the amount of extra time that you need to calculate all of this smoke bouncing off of all of these thousands of pieces, it really just wasn't worth it to spend that much extra time on it. So I'm just gonna turn it off completely and say solid object off. And I wanna do this for this one as well. So Phoenix FD properties, not a solid object, and for the windows as well, not a solid object. The next challenge we're facing is how do we make the smoke follow the path of the debris? And luckily Phoenix has exactly the two helpers that we need for something like this: path follow and body force. So first we can go under helpers Phoenix and create a follow path helper. And while we're here, let's also create a body force. Now for the body force, we need an object for the smoke to be attracted to. So I'll just make another sphere in the middle of our scene here and call that my body force sphere. Right click, go to object properties, make it not renderable, and right click again, go to Phoenix FD properties, make it not a solid object, and we can maybe just align this sphere to our attractor sphere from Tyflow and say okay. And you can right click again, go to object properties and make it display as box, and go back to body force, and for the object just select this sphere as our attractor, and we're gonna mess with the settings in a few seconds, so don't worry about that for now. Now for the path follow, we need to create a path for the smoke to follow. So I'll just scrub forward to see the path of the destruction, and I see that it looks something like this. So now I can just go into create splines and create a line, and you can just sort of create a line along the destruction path. So you can't really see it, but it is there. So I'm just clicking and dragging to create a curve, and then click and drag and create a curve, click and drag and create a curve, and then just sort of curve it in to the middle like this. So if I hit Alt Q, I can just go into line vertex, and you can maybe hit R, scale this, move it, rotate it, and fix this up just a little bit. So maybe, something like this. Again, I'm gonna hit R, scale this point up, just to smooth out that curve. So we have a nice little spiral. And then I can just rotate this and look at how high everything is. So generally I want to just raise this a bit higher. Then I can select maybe these two vertices, move them all the way down just to the height of the floor, and I can move this one higher, then select this one and move this one higher, select whatever is here, this one, move this one higher, and then select the very first one, which is somewhere around here. Where is she? Alt Q, here. And okay, this one is all the way here, which kind of sucks. So let's just move it back here. Move this one back and into the destruction. So I'm just fixing the path to match the debris, as you can see. I think that's pretty self-explanatory here. Right, so just scale that down. Maybe scale that down. E to rotate, rotate that. Select this point. Move that back and move it up. So remember, this is where all of the destruction will be attracted to. And I think I can actually delete this point and just extend this one a little bit further. So maybe something like this, and rotate it down. So now we have a pretty nice path for the smoke to be attracted to. So I can just go to path follow and say spline pick, and pick this spline here. Now our scene is getting kind of messy, so I can go back to frame 0. Now, since emitting smoke out of all of this destruction is gonna take a while, I wanna make sure that I test everything before I run any kind of lengthy simulations. So actually, I'm just gonna delete TyCache from the Phoenix source for now, and let's just create another sphere, which is sort of gonna be our test emitter sphere. So we can just name it that, test emitter sphere, and move it back here where sort of the destruction from the building would be coming out of. So maybe like here, and you can just make that our emitter for now, just so we can test that everything is working. Now, what I found is that for some reason, and this is probably a bug that hopefully they're gonna fix, but the beginning of the spline has to be inside of the grid in order for the smoke to be attracted to it, right? So I found that I actually had to just go into grid. So I actually need to expand the Y until it touches the beginning of the spline. Otherwise, the smoke will not fly to it. Again, this is probably just a bug, but it is something that I had to do that you might not have to do if you're watching this course half a year from now and they're gonna fix it. But it doesn't bother me because I know that the grid is gonna expand this far anyway because all the smoke will be here. So I don't mind that it has to be this big, but it is something that I have to do. Now we're getting a ridiculous amount of total cells, so we need to lower the resolution by a lot. So I'm gonna go all the way to maybe almost 20 centimeter cell size or something, or maybe let's do 15. So 1 million total cells. That should be enough just for us to test things. And we need to go into the Phoenix settings again, set Z as gemmed minus, and adaptive grid enabled by smoke with an extra margin of 2 with a threshold of 0.01. So this will just make the grid more sensitive to the smoke and make sure that nothing gets cut off, that the grid will expand as it should to cover all of the growing smoke. Now for the path follow settings, I had to play with this for a while before it did what it's doing over here. But basically what I did for the follow speed, I set it to 500. So follow speed is how fast the smoke travels along the spline, which here is pretty fast, but I wanted something dramatic like this because remember, I wanted the lightest particles to be attracted the fastest and the heaviest pieces to get there the slowest. In which case the smoke should be the fastest by far because it's so light. So that was sort of my idea behind it, but you can slow the smoke down from being so fast just by making this number lower. So for the pool speed, I ended up doing actually 5,000, and pool speed is basically the force at which the smoke is pulled toward the beginning of the spline or toward the spline body. So as you can see over here, even from these pieces, the smoke is being attracted toward the spline at a pretty fast force. So I set that pretty high as well. And the rotation speed, you can leave at 0. I ended up setting it to 400. And this will just add a little bit of detail. Rotational force basically controls how fast the smoke rotates around the spline. It's not strong enough to actually make it rotate, but it just adds a bit more variation to the movement. So these are really the only main settings that I would change, and influence set all the way to 1. The default of 0.5 will basically mix the velocity of the smoke by itself with the force, but we want the force to have full effect over everything. So we need to set this to a value of 1. And for the pipe radius, I ended up doing 50 centimeters. So basically that's the radius around the spline in which the smoke is allowed to basically float, right? So if you set this to a super low number like 1 centimeter, the smoke will be attracted to just a very small radius around the spline. But if we set it to 50, we get a much bigger tube in which the smoke is allowed to live. So that's why I get this big sort of, tube of smoke traveling along. Now, the next challenge was, what do I do with the smoke when it reaches the end? It sort of just gets released from the spline over here and then it just sort of floats. So I really wanted it to get attracted in the middle of our sort of black hole here at a pretty strong force. It's pretty hard to see because the smoke is actually being killed in this area, but I just used the body force for that. So I set it pretty high. I did a strength of 10,000 with a maximum distance of 1,500 centimeters. So remember, this maximum distance, if it's set to infinity, it means that the smoke will be attracted to the sphere from everywhere, even from over here. But what I want to do is I want the smoke to travel down the spline first, and then when it's within this radius of about 1,500 centimeters, that's when it should get pulled toward the body force. So I needed to adjust the maximum distance. Fade start, we can just do 0. Suppress orbit 1. So this will stop the smoke from basically overshooting, and it'll try and keep it stuck in place inside of the black hole. Damping, we can just do 0. So the last remaining thing before we run the simulation for the first time is, what do we do with the smoke once it's attracted to the body force? Remember, it's still not dead. It's gonna get attracted to our sphere here, this one, which right now is showed as a box, but it is a sphere. And what happens then? We need to kill the smoke somehow. And the best way I found is, basically we're gonna make another sphere, and this is gonna be our smoke kill sphere. And you can right click, go to Phoenix FD properties and set it to not a solid object and clear inside. So this way you're telling Phoenix that anything that is inside of the sphere, including smoke, temperature, liquid, everything that's listed in here, will be immediately killed, which actually works perfect for us, because I am just gonna put this sphere right in the middle of our imaginary black hole. So align and put it here, maybe scale it down a little bit, something like this. And I know that as soon as the smoke reaches the inside of this sphere, it will be killed. So I think I overdid it in my example. If you look over here, you can kind of see the edge of my kill sphere, right? The smoke is being killed right around here. So it almost looks like a mistake. You can see that sharp edge. But it's the only solution that I could really come up with. So that's what worked for me. And you can, again, right click, go to object properties, make it not renderable, and display as box as well. So we have a lot of sort of boxes in here, but everything should be named and make sense as to what everything does. So with all of this in place, let's just make sure that our Phoenix settings are good. So we have the cell size of about 15 centimeters. Now under dynamics, I'm just gonna leave everything at default here. For my final simulation, I did 2 steps per frame, but for now we can leave that at 1. And then just maybe under output, you can output velocity for potential motion blur, even though I found that motion blur just makes it take way longer to render without any noticeable difference. You can't really tell if there's motion blur of this on this smoke or not. It's sort of just smoke. You can't really tell, it doesn't matter, but we can export it just for good measure. And make sure that you save it somewhere, preferably on an SSD. And one more thing we can do is go under preview and enable the GPU preview. And you can also select this sphere here, go to Phoenix FD properties, make it not a solid object. All right, so with all of this in place, let's just run our test smoke simulation. Make sure you save it before you do that. All right, so I'm running this simulation and it is working, except I forgot to set this big activator box as not a solid object, so it's stopping the smoke from moving. This is such an easy mistake to do. That's why I always like to just do it first. Whenever I create an object, first thing I'll do is just make it not a solid object, because many times, like my simulation would not be running and it takes me a while to figure out why. But the good news is that the smoke is being attracted to the path. All right, so I ran this for about 60 frames and everything is working as it should. We have the smoke following the path first, and then when it reaches this threshold of the body force, it gets attracted in the middle, and in the middle here it's being killed by the kill sphere that we put in there. So everything seems to be working pretty well. We can just go under the volumetric render settings, under rendering, volumetric options, smoke color. So, you can make that lighter or darker. I think I'll make it a little bit lighter. And maybe you can give it sort of that dusty, dirty color, a little bit of sort of the building dust. Just a little hint of, just a little touch of brown, almost purely gray. And maybe just make it a little bit darker, sort of that destruction dust. And under opacity, I think I'll just do something like 0.2 to keep it pretty light. So now that we have this working, we can just go back to our fire source, remove the test sphere, and we can just hide that completely and add our tie cache concrete in here. One more little mistake or lesson that I had to learn was that even though the grid will expand to cover all of the smoke, the building is breaking this way to the left. And as the building breaks, it will break over here. But the grid doesn't know. Like the grid is only expanding based on the smoke, not based on the destruction. So actually I ended up with there being destruction back here with no smoke, and the smoke was only being born in the front. So unfortunately what we have to do is we have to make a pretty big grid and cover the entire building to make sure that we get it covered everywhere. So I'll just expand this on Y and move this all the way back. And remember, I have to have the beginning of the spline in the grid, and I have to have the whole building in the grid. Now, I don't need it any bigger than that. As far as this here, the grid will just expand to cover, whatever happens back here. But it has to be at least this big to cover everything we need. So with all of this in place, fingers crossed that when I run the simulation, the smoke will just be emitting out of the destruction pieces. Now, if I scrub through, I can see that the destruction doesn't really occur here until frame, until frame about 88 or 86. So we can go into the simulation settings and only enable the smoke simulation to start on frame 87. There's no reason for us to be simulating this for 87 frames of nothing if there's going to be no smoke. So with all that in place, let me just start the simulation. Alright, so I am running it, and it's kind of funny now because the smoke is being immediately emitted out of all of the pieces. So the good news is that yes, the smoke is being emitted out of them, but it happens immediately and we need to stop that from happening. We only want to emit the smoke out of these pieces once they start moving. So we can use Phoenix's modifier for this. So here under the fire source modifiers, you can click on the plus sign. And I want to modify outgoing velocity by speed and set the space to world and expand. And then this graph basically tells you how much smoke gets emitted at which speed. So basically I just need to create another point and drag it down. So I'm basically telling Phoenix that the pieces have to be moving at least this fast, which is around 50, before they start emitting smoke. And the way this is set up right now, the faster they're moving, the more smoke they're emitting, which is fine with me, right? I just need to stop them from emitting smoke when they're just sitting still. So that's what I will control with this point here. So maybe I can move it maybe to around 75 and see what they'll do. Run the simulation one more time. All right, so I'm watching the simulation and I kind of got carried away staring at it sim, because this is probably my favorite part of these things, is just watching the simulations run. So everything is working the way we want. Basically, we still have that old sphere cache here in the beginning. We can delete that later. But then on frame 87, you can see that it's not until the pieces start moving that they start emitting smoke. And as soon as they do, more and more smoke is being born. And then up here it starts breaking and smoke is being emitted from that. And everything sort of continues down the path here as it should. Now I just kind of don't like this this shape of the smoke, because it kind of goes up and then goes down. So we can select the line spline here and just maybe select this and rotate it just to give it that bulge up, and then it's just gonna go down just to fix that a little bit. So maybe something like this, and maybe rotate it out and move it in just to give it a nice curve for the smoke to follow in. So what to do now? The smoke setup is working and it's finished pretty much. The only thing I would do now if I were to run the final simulation is just go back under grid and give it just a touch more resolution. You really don't need much for something like this. You're not gonna be able to see the difference anyway. It's moving so fast and it's just sort of this dust in the middle of the debris. So I wouldn't overdo it, but maybe I would do like a 12 centimeter or 10 centimeter cell size just to give it more resolution. And then you can go under dynamics and set the steps per frame to 2. Just because the smoke is moving really fast, the pieces are moving pretty fast, and you don't really want any stepping or jittering or anything like that. So 2 steps per frame should comfortably cover everything that's happening inside of the scene. So I've already made this effect, so I don't think I'm gonna simulate this all over again for another 600 frames, but I'm gonna simulate it for a little bit just so that you can follow it with me one more time. And then when I'm done with the simulation, in the next lesson, I'll walk you through the rendering and how to render the smoke and the destruction separately.